Thank you very much for joining us here this morning. Can I just draw your attention to the chat function? Hopefully people are fairly familiar with Zoom these days, but Laura and Lucy will be managing the chat, so it'd be really good if you can introduce yourselves, say hello. We're going to do as much as we possibly can today to integrate questions, live questions from the floor as it were, and the chat function. So please ask questions that you've got, make comments, and we'll pause periodically to take note of those and bring those into the discussion.
Yeah, hi, I'm Laura. I'm going to be on the chat today. So do feel free to drop your questions in there. Does everyone know where that is? At the bottom of your screen, you'll see a little kind of speech bubble icon. That's your chat. If you click on that, you'll see a kind of feed of messages coming through. I can already see a couple of people have found us there. Ruth Gawthorpe's found us there. Donna Simmons, Horse Associates, is here. Hi, Donna. Nicholas Bailey's here. He's doing he was previously supported internship coordinator for Cornwall and Isles of Scilly. It's great that you could be here, Nicholas. Edward Chapman had problems getting in, but you're here now. That's the main thing. Katie Sawyer from Bodmin. Where is that there, Katie? Bodmin Keep, I think. Great. And Sino has just asked, will the recording be made public and circulated afterwards? Both are going to happen. So we are recording this and it will be going on to our YouTube channel later, and a copy will be circulated to all registrants as well. So just to keep that in mind. I'll dash off and back into the chat for now.
Thank you, Laura. Thanks very much. So a warm welcome. My name is Laurie Mcgowan and I'm the project manager for the Inclusivity project. Really pleased that you can join us today. Welcome to those who've joined the Inclusivity project for the first time, but also those who have attended previous events. Really warm welcome to you. So we're really excited and pleased to be hosting this webinar. What is bias and how does it affect the workplace? We think a really timely discussion to be having, both in terms of the Inclusivity project based here in Cornwall, but obviously at a national and international scale as well. Firstly, just to make everybody aware that the webinar is being recorded, so just to make you aware of that if you have any particular concerns, but we will be making that available as we go forwards. So I'm the project manager for the Inclusivity project and going to be channeling my David Dimbleby hopefully later on in the session, looking to feed questions, some that we've received in advance, some that will be coming through the chat, and obviously from yourselves here in person as well. And this is a really important issue being explored today through our research and your personal interest. We've got a really good number of attendees today, so it shows that this is a key issue, timely issue that people really want to discuss. Before I introduce our panel, or rather before our panel introduce themselves, I'm just going to give a little bit of background to the Inclusivity project and the session today, introduce other team members, and just a little bit of housekeeping about how we plan to run the webinar. The Inclusivity project has a really key aim of engaging with small businesses within Cornwall and the Isles of Scilly, and getting their perspective on employing individuals who are older, disabled, and people who have long-term health conditions. The project's been running for 15 months now, and it's fair to say that we are really operating, everybody is in a different world to when this project started, and we really recognise this. The impact of COVID-19 has had an impact on everybody, but really particularly small businesses, business owners, the labour market as a whole, and disproportionately, we feel, really for older people, people with disabilities and health conditions, also people from Black, Asian and ethnic minorities in terms of levels of deprivation and the impact that and the likelihood of catching coronavirus has on those particular groups. So we are in a different world. The project started looking to explore about the impact and reducing the gap between people who are employed and those who are not employed with disabilities and people of older age. There were high levels, or there currently are fairly high levels of employment in Cornwall and across the country, but we know we're entering a really unknown phase, and are indeed have been in an unknown phase for some period, which is likely to lead to high levels of unemployment, and with a potential knock-on effect to people with disabilities, older workers being pushed down the priority list and being able to access meaningful work. So we're really conscious that where we are now is a different place to where we were 15 months ago when the project started. We've got real ambition nationally and locally to improve the health and well-being of workers and potential employees, and that's in recognition of Cornwall's demographics, being an older population. And we are aiming to do that really through two key areas, which is through business engagement activity, so working with those SMEs, supporting them with innovative solutions and ideas around new products and services, and also our really exciting research activity. So I'm going to explain a bit more about those later in the webinar, but they're two key aims of the project. And as I've said, we're really looking to increase the research, analysis and understanding of workplace health, focusing on SMEs in Cornwall and the Isles of Scilly, but recognising that what we learn will be applicable across the country and internationally. So a really exciting project that we're glad you're a part of today. Just a quick word on our partners. So the project is funded by the European Union European Regional Development Fund with extra support from the Southwest Academic Health Science Network. And we're really proud to be working alongside local partners, Disability Cornwall and the Isles of Scilly, Age UK and the Cornwall and Isles of Scilly LEP. And between our strong partnership, we've got huge positive contacts with local businesses in the area, communities, and really pleased to be working with the expertise of all of our partners. Okay. So as well as the impacts of COVID, it's really important, I think, for us to recognise events of recent months, really, including the killing of George Floyd on the 25th of May in Minneapolis, and really the subsequent Black Lives Matter movement that's taken place globally since then. So bias, the topic of today's conversation, really, in its most extreme form, can be represented in racism, sexism, and any other forms of prejudice. And though Cornwall is quite a different place to Minneapolis, you know, we have our own challenges, and it's really important that we discuss those as part of this project and with you today. So what I'd like to do is introduce our panel, who'll be taking some of your questions. You've heard from Laura, who'll be managing the web chat, but I'd like to pass over to Dawn, then Digger, and then Daniel, if you'd like to introduce yourselves.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Dawn George, and there's lots of names I don't know, but I am the HR Director for Eden. So there's some obvious links there in terms of my role and responsibility for our staff and volunteer team, but my remit is slightly wider than that, as well as my role encompasses responsibility for inclusion, and that's not just of our staff and volunteer population, but our visitors too. So I kind of wear two hats really when I'm doing things in HR, but you know, without doubt, if you're making amendments for one set of those people, it will be helpful for the other set of people. So we learn by our experiences of what we do around inclusion on a visitor basis, because that also helps us from a staff and volunteer basis to appreciate who we're dealing with, basically, and we try to make Eden as accessible and as inclusive as we possibly can. The byline that we use, and is always a working one, it's not something just sort of say is done, but we talk about, when we do our EDI training, we talk about diversity being what you have, and then inclusion being what you do about it. So the one part of that, and when we're talking about Cornwall, it's we know that's limited, but actually what you do then to broaden those boundaries is the important piece around inclusion. And I think this is where this fits in really well around bias. It's been an interest for me for a good 3 years now, so I'm looking forward to talking a little bit further about that and hearing some questions and views.
Thank you, Dawn. Tigger?
Hello. Forgive me, I've got a few internet problems this morning, so if I dip in and out, I must apologise. I've been rushing around trying to set it up. But hi, everybody. My name is Tigger Pritchard. I wear a couple of hats as well. I know Eden brilliantly, so hello there, Eden. You are lush, and I miss you. I'm chair of the National Autistic Society in Cornwall, which I've done for a couple of years now. Awesomely autistic myself, and I'm very passionate about exploring the world of bias on autism in the workplace and lots of other areas. So I work alongside the National Autistic Society, and I also work myself with the Autism Coffee Shop around Cornwall and around Great Britain. And what I found more and more, and what I'm realizing more and more, is there is a massive unconscious bias right from the initial diagnostic issue of looking at autism and so on. Even that term itself is extremely negative. And alongside other amazing individuals across the country and across the world, I'm part of a culture that wants to change how people view individuals who are also autistic and get rid of all that bias that's in place consciously and unconsciously. Well, that was me.
Thank
Next
you.
one.
Thank you, Tia.
Sorry.
There's a natural pause while people unmute themselves, isn't there, it seems. Daniel.
Good morning, everyone. My name's Daniel Derbyshire. I'm a research fellow working on the Inclusivity project. I specialise in behavioural economics, and a part of the research that I'm doing at the moment is looking at unconscious bias as it affects disabled people and older people, the two groups that we're interested in as part of the Inclusivity project. And so we're hoping to, in the next couple of months, launch one of these unconscious bias tests online. And so hopefully that'll be something that kind of happens in the next few months. That's kind of where my interest in the area comes from.
Brilliant, thank you. Warm welcome to our panel. I'm just going to go through a couple of housekeeping elements before I'm going to pose the first question to Daniel. So there's a pre-warning there, really. But just in terms of asking questions, as we said, the chat's there for you to use. At a particular time, we'll sort of pause. If people want to ask questions just through Zoom, then we'd ask you to raise your hand, which you can do, I think, if you click on the participants button at the bottom, then you'll see yourself, your name there, and you should be able to just click raise hand. And though it may take a little bit of time, please be patient with us. We'll come to you to ask your question. Laura will be feeding questions in from the web chat, and thank you again to those people who submitted questions as part of sign up. We'll cover those as well. Okay. Yeah, if everyone can be on mute throughout, unless you're asking a question, and I think I've covered most of that. Okay, right. First question, Daniel. What does bias mean to you, and can you expand on some of your research background and experience, please?
Yeah, sure. So to me, bias, as we've already kind of said, it can either be conscious or unconscious, but it's the kind of assumptions and kind of stereotypes that you instantly make about people. So the way that we are looking at it is with something known as the implicit association test. This is a test developed about 20 years ago that kind of quantifies people's level of unconscious bias. So the most popular form of it, for probably understandable reasons, is the race version. It's especially popular in America for, again, obvious reasons. It's very widely studied throughout the literature. The effect that it has on, for example, police officers. It's been done with school teachers, with judges, with all kinds of really kind of specialist populations. And also there's from Harvard something called Project Implicit, which is a kind of public version of it. And millions of people have done this, and the data is publicly available and all this kind of stuff. And so it's a really interesting, rich data set that's available there. In terms of conscious bias as well, I think we're going to focus probably quite a lot on unconscious bias today, but I think that we should acknowledge still that conscious bias is still a problem. Can just cite two examples just from the past week that I've spotted. One was a black trainee vicar who applied for a job in Durham and was told that he was rejected because he may feel uncomfortable given that the congregation was, this is a quote, monochrome white working class. So another example, again, this was literally yesterday or the day before, a job advert in Australia for care workers. And it said in the job advert, we request no dark-skinned brackets Indian or African applicants for this role, as per the client's request. And so while we're going to probably, I think, talk a lot about unconscious bias, we should acknowledge that there's still a lot to do about conscious bias as well. I think maybe open it up to the others if anyone else.
Brilliant. Thank you, Daniel. Dawn, come to you next, really. And I'm sure there'll be plenty of discussion about this, but like to hear your views in terms of bias in the workplace, and what steps people can take to raise awareness and understanding at both sort of a board and strategic level, and as reflecting in some of our questions that came in beforehand about dealing with operational staff or colleagues about bias in the workplace.
Yeah, so I think Eden, many would see as hopefully it's a good employer in terms of expectations and what we are there to do, but there are always improvements. You know, it's not a perfect world, things go wrong and things need to be addressed. In terms of specifically in this area, we've really strengthened people understanding what bias is. So to me, that is about people making choices, as Daniel's obviously already said, be that conscious or unconscious, people making choices, views, decisions, either in good knowledge of what they're doing, or they don't know they're doing it, and that's an issue because it automatically becomes a bias that they're not aware of. So in terms of trying to get people in a space where that has more meaning, one of the things we've been doing over the last 3 years, and so it was the Harvard batch of tests that got me first started on this and being really interested in it. Probably about 3 years ago, we were going through some senior recruitment, and I kept hearing something from our chair, which at the time, we've changed chair since, but she used to call our board male, pale and stale. Draw from that your own conclusions, but the bottom line is it wasn't very diverse, and the secondary part to that was we knew that already. So if you look at the window, we were already looking at gender pay reporting and what that might look like. I think we've done 3 returns now, and each year that's improved in terms of the diversity and the balance that we have. But I did some of these tests with the board, so my challenge to them was, well, okay, if that's the view of the board, perhaps we need to understand why that's happening. So we did some of those tests, and you know, I said to the guys, I don't need to know your results, you need to know your results. You need to know why this is happening. You don't need to tell me, but you need to be promising me that you're aware of them, and that will change the way you think about something, or you self-check when you do that. So that's led to some changes in a more senior framework. So that's obviously been good to see, but it's not just a done thing, it's something we continue to work at. But the other thing we've done is built some of those exercises into our EDI, Equality, Diversity and Inclusion training. And some of those practical exercises we do in that training, which everyone has to do, it's mandatory, and there is a second tier of that for anyone that manages. We've built in some practical applications, and you know, we make this sounds awful, but we put people in an uncomfortable spot so that they can understand what it might be like to be in an area that receives discrimination. And I've seen it doing the rounds recently, but we use a number of tools for that. Some are practical application, some are videos, but the point is it gets people talking about it. The other thing we've done is then made sure we act on it. So we've always had a zero tolerance to any form of bullying, harassment. Yes, we've had cases and we've had to deal with those, but we always do deal with them. If we have an issue raised, and I'm not talking about just formal grievances, but if we have issues raised, you know, we follow a protocol of investigation, the learnings from that, taking that back, and if we need to look at training again. And in severe cases, have released people from the organisation where their biases have been inappropriate and, in some cases, frankly, illegal in terms of what we see. So for me, having that acknowledged at a strategic level by the board is the most important thing, because without them taking ownership of it, all the things we then try and do to have a better recruitment process, culture at work, being open to, you know, there's several people here that I can see I've worked with on different types of projects around how we include people in our community that are not mainstream. So that's something that I think is partly what any employer should do, but it is definitely what we should be doing, Eden as an educational charity, helping that as part of our community and having those things right.
Can I just come back on that, Laurie?
You do, yeah.
So I think it's really interesting, Dawn, what you were saying about the reaction of the senior leadership in some sense. And I think that I was reading something from ACAS yesterday. And I think it's really kind of important to contextualise that unconscious bias is natural, that it's unintended, that it can affect your decision making, but that it can also be mitigated. And I think it's also important to kind of contextualise the results of the unconscious bias test, which is that basically most people are coming out with at least some level of bias. A good from my looks at it, a good 80% of people show at least some bias. And so it's not that anyone's being singled out or kind of picked on in that sense. I think that's kind of an important acknowledgement as well.
Yeah, I think people, when I've done them, regardless of level actually, and I've done it myself, I think people are sometimes very surprised at the outcomes. They believe that they are not biased in any way. They believe that they're a very inclusive person in terms of the decisions they take, and have been quite humbled when we've done the tests. And then it's actually led us to look on at other things. And I know we're talking about, employment today, but on the back of that, we also went back and looked at some of our advertising, both web-based and campaigns we put out, because they're staring at us that wasn't inclusive. So there were biases happening within that about who our audience was, because you put that out on a public feed, and there'll be portions of a population that say, well, I'm obviously not welcome there, I don't see anybody like me. So it's not just that we've used it in that area, it's led to some work in terms of marketing and research around our visitor population as well.
Thank you, Dawn. Edward's patiently got his hand up. Have you got a question or a comment, Edward?
Yeah, it's around the unconscious bias aspect. I've spent most of my working life as an accountant. I am getting better now. And I remember years ago, there was an experiment done where they put a bunch of accountants in a room, I think a bunch of engineers and a bunch of solicitors, and they'd pair up without talking. And all the accountants picked the accountants without talking. So there's some very strong stuff going on there. And I've noticed myself that when I go to networking events, when we used to do them physically, the first people I'd start to talk to turned out to be accountants. So if it's that powerful, what powerful tools can we have to counter it?
I think some of that goes back to the being aware that they are there, and unless people have some form of training, instruction, development, information that makes them check that will continue. So it comes back to people being prepared, I think, to challenge themselves, but definitely for organisations to be prepared to challenge that as part of their culture and what they develop.
Thank you.
Just in there, I mean, I think for small businesses, they haven't got an organisation to give them those things. They're very often, and this is something that also interests me, they're very often described as one-man bands. Not one people bands or one person bands, one man band. But I think for the one man band or the one person business or the two person business, how do you have processes and things? Where can you get the resources to help you eliminate your bias?
So I think some of that can be, and I know Claire's on the call from Claire also wears several hats, but one of those is LEP-based in these projects. And I think with the hubs that are available for small business support, there is a view that if it's not already there, that would be a good place for it to be. I know Claire and I have discussed that before about how we share larger organisation experiences and resources that are not proprietary into the smaller sector, because we've talked about it in other ways as well, things like occupational health. So I think there is a desire to do that and support the smaller big businesses through networks like the Hub, certainly in Cornwall.
And so when we look at bias in the kind of academic literature, we break it down into a number of different types of bias, one of which is known as affinity or similarity bias. I think it's really interesting, Edward, what you were saying, that kind of in a room you were able to pick out the accountants kind of instinctively. I just think that's quite an interesting aspect of it.
I'm going to come to Ruth Gorsop's question in a moment, but there, as I understand it, in terms of when recruitment takes place, you're often drawn to people who are similar to yourselves. in different ways.
Vaughan's effect.
I think that echoes what Edward's saying about, within a room or whether you're sat across the table from somebody. And Dan, perhaps in a moment, you talk about some of the steps you've talked about in terms of, and I appreciate this is possibly for larger organisations where there's multiple people or an HR team to implement some of these things, and more difficult for a one-person operation, about how to mitigate and minimise some of that bias creeping in. But also just picking up the point on some of this, it requires difficult conversations, doesn't it? It requires challenging colleagues or even managers to face up to some of these things, and that's not easy at all. I'm conscious that Ruth has asked the question. Ruth, do you want to ask this live, or are you happy for us to read it in the chat?
I'm happy for you to read it.
Okay, got your question from the chat then, Ruth. But just before I add that in, because it's slightly switching topic, I'd just like to feed in a couple of other things that have come out of the chat as well, if that's all right. One's from Sino from the National Trust, who says it would be helpful to learn how staff can feedback unconscious bias in the workplace, feedback their experiences of it, Sino. Is that what you're thinking? Dawn, would you like to come back on that first?
So,
sorry to kick your
no, that's okay. If I'm interpreting
line,
that correctly, so if somebody feeds back that they've had some sort of prejudice applied to them, if I'm kind of along those lines, if they're feeling they've been, yeah, okay. So in our case, we would, like all procedures, we would start that informally if we could, if it was something that we could try and resolve quickly, locally, because, obviously what we want to do is get the culture right. So we would want to understand what had happened, and then we would look at how we tackle that. Some of that is about individual awareness, and some of that is about manager support. So we would look at that from the point of view to start with, okay, what have they not got that we can help them with? So is that tools or training? But sometimes it's as simple as looking at it from the other side of the coin. So, you said this, and the phrase we all hear is banter, but actually sometimes behind that banter is what you get from unconscious bias, because it's come from a place that is there in your being. So we have to try and encourage people to change that. And the ultimate is, if they can't change that and they continue to present with biases that are not conducive to the workplace, we'll take them down a formal procedure. But in terms of acting on it, what we wouldn't do is say, oh, I don't think you're right, because the first rule in this for us when we're dealing with anything like this as a team is, if you've got a perception something's been hurt, if an individual comes and their perception is something's not right and they feel aggrieved, then we need to understand why that is. We can't just dismiss it. And I think that's important, that you don't just, I've seen it in other organisations where people say, oh, don't worry, that's just so and so and how they are. Well, that's not acceptable. So we would deal with that and try and reset people's thinking.
Thank you. So Ruth's question, sorry to have delayed that a bit, but I sort of wanted to feed that one in because it seemed to relate to what we were speaking about already. Ruth Gawthorpe from Smart Working Revolution has a question to direct towards Tigger, and it's what are the main barriers that autistic candidates encounter and have overcome to get a role? She says, we're promoting hub and remote working at the Smart Working Revolution, and we're trying to champion that everyone should be part of UK PLC. And so Tigger, and also from my personal point of view, Tigger, have you ever experienced any of these kinds of bias against autism yourself as well? Love to hear from you personally.
Lush question. With most issues around bias, we're looking at something that's extremely historical, that goes back decades, if not, a long time. So I mentioned early on there about even the term from my viewpoint, diagnosis is a negative term. It instantly says there's something wrong with you. And I know the autism spectrum is huge. And from an autism cultural viewpoint and professional viewpoint, it's changing drastically from day to day. And there's lots going on around the planet. But I think we have a fear, a misconception, a medical model still. As soon as somebody mentions the word autism, I think the barriers we have are that up until recently, from maybe because of media input and so on, like, Big Bang Theory and various Netflix shows and so on and so forth, the A Word and so on, there was a perceived idea of what autism meant. Years ago, it was Rain Man. It was, Dustin Hoffman character Raymond, all the rest of it. You can do this, you can do that. From that aspect of savants and Asperger's issues as well. But I think that the bias around autism is still extremely horrendously based in a model that I thought once had disappeared, and it's the medical model. It's where instantly, as a parent, be viewed of either you've done something wrong as a parent, then if you do carry on down the diagnostic route as an individual or for a child, then it's seen as being that something's wrong, the person's not right. There's an awesome guy I follow a lot called Dr. Luke Baird, who the term neurodiversity is popular at the moment, and he coined the term predominant neural type, which I think is an interesting term because it shows that neurodiversity is across the planet as a whole, but the predominant neural type is what a lot of individuals are being asked to fit into. And because we're being asked to fit into that neural type, we have issues with sensory, communication, cultural issues, adaptation issues, so on and so forth. And I think they are massive across a lot of the countries across the globe. So I think that it's incredibly historical in nature, and very sad to say it's still based and seeped in a medical model, and it's still top down. You still have all these professionals that are writing books, that are putting forward their viewpoints, that are putting forward diagnostic criteria, so on and so forth. It's still, there's something wrong with you. You're not right because you don't fit the preferred neural type, the predominant neural type across the globe. And that's something I'm beginning to realize a lot. Personally, it's only very recently I've decided to wave the autism flag for myself, because I've realized, maybe that's why I loved what I did so much, that I awesomely fit. So at the moment I self-diagnose and may well get diagnosed at some point in the future. And I must confess, what I'm finding at the moment, and I'm chatting to lots of friends in Cornwall across the country and other areas, is that the minute you mention the word, there's a pause. There's a slight pattern. You can see people boxing you all of a sudden in terms of, right. And then it's what they've learned about autism, what they know about autism, be it a TV show or something they read or a course they've been on or real life experience and so on and so forth. So what I often see is there's that boom, kind of like, oh, okay. Very often I will hear, you can't be autistic because this, that, the other, and so on. I think that again to me highlights the fact that the understanding of autism in the greater population isn't as awesome as it should be. And that's something that a lot of people are trying to change. So I think that it's, we're still being boxed by the medical model, which I think is devastatingly wrong. We're still being boxed by a history of you're not right, you're not right, you're not right. And you've got to fit into what we consider right. That's that great big predominant neural type from a neurodiversity viewpoint. And I think that even though there's a lot of popular media stuff out there, I mentioned Big Bang Theory, none of them have a label or signpost. People just assume Sheldon is autistic. You've got the A Word. There's a lot of really good stuff that's come out recently that has helped to change people's attitudes and understanding of what the vast spectrum of autism is. But it's really recent. And I think that a lot of people link that word to mental health issues, for which there are a lot of. And box you incredibly because of a label, a signpost that you just say out loud. And I think that from an employer viewpoint, there's a fear, there's a lack of understanding, there's a hesitancy which gets in the way of employing some of the most amazing people I know with the most amazing gifts across the board. So I think it's very much historical. There's a lot of reading I'm doing at the moment, finding about the issues with the term diagnosis and identification and so on and so forth. But I think that there's a lot of barriers still to overcome, but I do think that we are in a positive moment in time, even with the terrible pandemic, where people are stopping and pausing and rethinking and re-exploring attitudes and becoming, I hope, more inclusive because of that.
Thank you, Tigger. I've got a question.
Can I just jump in? Sorry, Laurie, on that.
Yeah.
I think that, like I was saying, I think that there's a big aspect of the kind of affinity similarity bias going on there, when what Tigger was saying, but also a lot of confirmation bias, whereby people are just looking for the things that kind of confirm their preconceived notions, and so they focus on those aspects. And in particular, when you were saying, Tigger, that you get told, oh, you can't be autistic because you're not X, Y, Z. You don't confirm to my view of what what an autistic person is supposed to be in some sense.
Very much so.
Just a little comment.
Thank you. A question from me, Tigger, if that's all right, and this may actually be reconfirming my own bias, in confirmation bias, Dan, as you've just mentioned there. So happy to be shot down. But it's been mentioned to me, I guess, and in general as well, that there potentially are some roles which may be more suitable or for people with autism. Is that itself a bias in assuming that, you know, some people with autism may be better at certain roles than others, or do you think there's?
I think it's across the board. We are all better at some tasks than others. I hate mathematics. You can be something to do with maths. I'm terrible, and yet I've got a friend of mine who is possibly the best mathematician I know. So I think we all have gifts. We all have strengths. But I do think, and it's because of historical, especially media-based stuff, you automatically think, oh, you've got a specialist skill. You can do this, you can do that. And I think that kind of bias is there sometimes a lot in the community and especially in the workplace. And I think that, you know, in the changing climate we're in at the moment, a lot of people are realizing they're just looking and boxing straight away, and it's something we do need to move from. So yeah, you very often get people say, oh, you must be really good at this. I've had somebody say to me, oh wow, you're really good at maths. I've gone, no, I haven't even got, I am so old, I did GCSE, O-level, I can't remember now, but I haven't even got that, because I couldn't stand mathematics. And people think, oh, really? But, so there is that kind of thought processes and biases still out there. But I think it's across the board. Everybody is good at something that somebody else might not be. And it's just how we are as a species, really.
Excellent. Thank you very much. I'm going to come to Laura, who may be pulling out some questions and comments from the chat. But just while we do that, you know, really encourage everybody to share, you know, share your experiences and your thoughts as part of this conversation. I appreciate it might not be easy. There may be some delicate things that need to be considered about, you know, your workplace or your own personal situation. But please do share your experiences. It'll all add value to this this conversation. Thank you, Laura.
Some lovely, lively sharing going on in the chat over here as well. A couple of questions have come through about Cornwall. One comes from Jill Pipkin. She says, do you feel we have a higher level of unconscious bias in Cornwall due to the lack of diversity in our community? And that's, I guess, for the whole panel. I'd like to add in another comment from Brian Triguna that says, what do you think can be done to celebrate diversity in Cornwall and thereby help to educate people about the benefits of differences? So there's two questions. Do you feel we have a higher level of unconscious bias in Cornwall due to the lack of diversity? And what do you think can be done to celebrate the diversity that there is in Cornwall?
It's a really interesting one, isn't it? So I'm not Cornish. I moved to Cornwall 10 years ago to work for Eden. And one of the first observations I made in my first week, having come from a very, it was an international role and lots of travel and lots of very diverse cities and centres. I spotted something in my first week in Cornwall working here that I had never spotted when all the years I used to come down here on holiday. And that was predominantly around racial diversity more than anything. And I asked one of our directors at the time if Eden was typical of the Cornwall demographics, and was told, well, yeah, actually, I think we're better than average. So I think, is there more of it here than anywhere else? Difficult to assess, because I think, you know, as we've already heard, people will have their own unconscious biases and they won't know what they are until they're tested. I think it does strike some interesting acceptance levels here, not just around race and, if you like, all the protected characteristics. I think that takes a little bit more work sometimes, from my experience of training people.
but I'm not sure it's more than anywhere else. I think you might see different unconscious biases in other areas of the country depending on, you know, what their background was, their views were, and how they'd been brought up within that environment. So I'm not sure it's necessarily higher, it's just possibly different.
Yeah, I'll agree with that, if I may. I said yesterday when we had a brief pre-chat that I moved down from Wolverhampton in 1987, and when I went to school, I was in a minority because of my colour. So when I came down to Cornwall, I was like, and so I'd say it's here, it's different, but it's here. But certainly I was like, wow, when I came to Cornwall, and when I got in touch with a lot of my friends of country, they were like, really? And I was like, yeah, it's just like very different.
And so if I could just pick up on the point about, is there a higher level of bias in Cornwall? I'll be honest, I don't know, but that's something we're hoping to have an answer to in a few months once we've kind of done our part of the research, because we're hoping to get some people from Cornwall and then people from outside of Cornwall as well. Just an interesting other aspect to talk about, as Tigger said, we were kind of talking about this a bit yesterday about how do you represent people who aren't represented in the general population almost. And so one example that I saw the other day was that at Royal Cornwall Hospital, they're looking to encourage higher levels of BAME representation at higher levels of management, senior consultant, upper managers. And I think for me in particular, that makes sense in that context specifically, where they have a lot of BAME workers at lower levels already, naturally because of it being a hospital. And so I think it is a really interesting question, and I'm not necessarily sure that I know the answer.
Right. I've just got a follow-up to that really, in terms of from an inclusivity project point of view, I guess recognising Cornwall, similar to Devon and others, has an older demographic, then one way, you know, seeing more older people in the workforce would be a natural way of seeing a more representative and more reflective working population to reflect Cornwall as a place. I know that's just one particular area. But that's something, you know, we'd hope to support SMEs and businesses do in terms of supporting people with disabilities, long-term health conditions, and older workers. But we recognise that's, you know, potentially a challenge for SMEs. One other thing really is about there's a question about what support, you know, how do we continue this conversation? And it's something I was really keen to raise, in that this is one session. We're not going to have all the answers, but again, it was mentioned yesterday that this is an evolving, continuing conversation. And I think we would be keen to do that in terms of people present today, and in future, setting up potentially a network through the Inclusivity project so that people can tap in, share ideas, share resources, as conversations around bias particularly moves forward. So if you'd be willing to participate in that, then let us know, that'd be great. And obviously we'll be in contact and sharing future events and activities that we'll be doing. But, you know, really to say that this is hopefully the start of a continuing conversation with you, not just a one-off webinar. Laura.
Yes, well, certainly Mary Godwin, who is a director of Bodmin Keep Army Museum, was asking very much along those lines. If anyone has any practical resources for staff or volunteer EDI training that they'd be prepared to share, she'd be very interested. And perhaps that's the start of a conversation, Mary, or a network, or a working group that could come out of a discussion like this that Laurie was suggesting. Are you ready for another question, Laurie? Okay, so this came from Nicholas Bailey. Where have I got it? Where have we got it? Oh no, sorry, I'll come back to your point, Nicholas. Thanks for what you fed in. I like this question so much from Edward Chapman, who says, having moved from being an accountant to a writer, my focus has changed from numbers to words, and I'm interested in the panel's view about how much effect language and words have on bias, and perhaps on how bias shows up, right?
So can I just start by just giving a quick example, and then I'll pass over to the other two. So some of our project team shared with me a few weeks ago an example of Thames Water's recruitment practices, and they were originally getting 8% female applicants for their jobs. So they went through their adverts and they kind of really forensically went through the wording that they were using in their adverts. And once they started to remove words like competitive, confident, and champion, the proportion of female applicants went up from 8% to about 46%. And so the language that you shape, it will affect who applies for your job in the first instance, even beyond, and at every other step as well, I think. But that was just a quick example of how language can really shape who looks for you rather than who you're looking for, even.
Totally agree with that. And I think from an HR perspective, that's something it's one of those you have to keep asking yourself, is it the right pitched at the right level to make it inclusive? You know, some of that is legally required. So some of the examples that were given earlier on, I think they were outside the UK, but some of the examples of worded adverts and excluding people right from that point, let alone any of the language that was used, we're not allowed to do in the UK anyway, which is, you know, I would expect to be hauled over the coals if I put words like that out. So it definitely makes a difference in terms of the language you use, whether you're trying to attract a candidate or you're trying to attract somebody to come and visit you or use your services. Yes.
And I'll go right back to what I said early on. You're diagnosed, and to me, diagnosed is automatically there's something wrong with you, and that's from all the professionals virtually across the globe that look at the awesome world of autism. They diagnose, and that to me straight away is negative and plants the seed for an individual, as well as for those people around that person, that there's something wrong, and it goes on from there. So language is extremely powerful.
Excellent. Thank you all very much for your comments. What I am going to do now, if that's all right, is sorry, Laurie, you've got your hand up.
Sorry, yes. I was just going to feed in a couple of things that people had said just in response to this idea of whether Cornwall is as diverse as other areas, just while we're on the tail end of that. Laura Fleming says that when I first came to Cornwall 10 years ago, I went to a tiny gay pride parade in Truro, and it has grown annually. So perhaps people are showing their diversity more openly. And Ruth Gripper, also from the Inclusivity Project, says that she guesses that diversity isn't just visible diversity. Her background is in the charity sector, where race and class are both significant issues. So back to you, Laurie.
Thank you. Was just going to take a minute or two during the conversation really to talk or give you a bit more information about some of the support and services that we've got being delivered through the Inclusivity Project, and to touch a little on some of the additional research work that's taking place. But while I do that, if you reflect on some of the powerful conversations and comments we've had in the first half of this session, and line up any questions or indeed put them in the chat just while I give you a bit more information, then that will give us some areas to talk about after my commercial break, if that's okay. So if you just bear with me a second. Okay, so hopefully you can all see the slide there. I wanted to talk a little bit about the additional research themes that are taking place within the project. Daniel's explained some of his activity, but may want to expand on some of the economic identification of incentives that he's focusing on. But I did want to talk about the qualitative research that's taking place, being led by colleagues who are looking to engage with SMEs and micro businesses to really find out what their experiences are in terms of employing, recruiting diverse workforces, and some of the challenges they potentially faced. So they'll be doing that through a series of one-to-one and group interviews with employees and employers, and looking to find out a bit about the organisational history, any current issues that's taking place, and policies or processes that they may have in place. And really looking to explore in detail what challenges or successes really they've had in terms of employing a diverse and inclusive workforce. So Lucy Sabova and Emmylou Rance are academics who are leading on that activity. The next step and perhaps bigger picture activity that's taking place is an exploration of systems and policies through a system dynamics model, which has been led by Ishmael, a colleague of ours in the business school who's based in Penryn. And he's really looking to identify what policy changes at both a national and local level will have the biggest impact in reducing that gap between the number of people who are employed in the labour market and those people with who are older or people with disabilities and health conditions, and which actions and policy decisions will have the biggest impact in reducing that gap. Really exciting process, engaging SMEs, policymakers and individuals to engage in conversations. And just before potentially Dan talks a little bit more about his activity, each of this research activity we're looking to engage and recruit SMEs and individuals in this discussion. So please keep an eye out for the work that we're doing, the messages we're sending out, because we'd really appreciate and benefit from your input into these conversations, either at an in-depth level from an ethnographic point of view, or in a sort of a wider systems conversation. So more information is available on our website under the research area. Similarly, just drop a note in the chat or keep an eye out for our messages, because we're looking to engage quite a large number of businesses in this activity. Dan, did you want to say anything more about your specific research activity?
Well, yeah, I'll just expand on it a little bit. So like I said, we're going to be looking initially to measure implicit bias. And then once we've done that, we're going to be looking at how you can design the recruitment process in such a way to encourage greater kind of buy-in from the people we're interested in, people with disabilities and older people. So doing something similar to that example I gave from Thames Water, for example, something along those lines. That's kind of the direction we think it's going at the moment, at least.
Brilliant, thank you. So that work's going to be ongoing for the next 18 months. So do let us know if you're interested or want more information on any of that activity. The next really important key part of the Inclusivity project is about supporting and engaging with Cornish SMEs. And we do this through a range of activities. As you can imagine, previously this would have been initially through face-to-face meetings, attending and hosting our own events to engage with businesses. But over the last couple of months, we're really pleased, and I think it's been a positive step in terms of delivering digital activities, webinars and conferences similar to this. So engaging with SMEs is really about working with businesses to support the development of new products and services to encourage and support healthier workplaces, as we've talked about in terms of being more inclusive and diverse. We do this through a knowledge exchange meeting where we'd have a conversation over a couple of meetings to find out again where your business is at, growth opportunities, challenges that you may face, and really understand your business and where you want to go and the ideas that you have. The next step on the ladder really would potentially be an in-residence, which is a mini research project in itself. We'd pull in support of our project partners and academics to support you and your idea really take fruition. So that could be around data analysis, it could be exploring market opportunities, and really pulling in the expertise to work alongside you. And we can cover the cost of an individual for up to 12 working days to feed into that conversation, explore those ideas and take those forwards. So that's our in-residence activity. And we also have a couple of financial support areas. The first being an idea generation grant, which is typically around £1,000 to £2,000, seed funding, easily accessible, and to help you develop ideas again. It could be the purchasing of some equipment, some software, or other activities to develop a new product or service. And finally, we've got some larger finance available that would be follow-on grant funding or follow-on research activity, which would take place after the in-residence. So through a bit of a stepping stone activity, if there's progress being made and the relationship developing really well, then you as a business can access additional funding to take things to the next level, and that'll be more than the previous figures that I've talked about. So lots of opportunity to get involved in the project. just in terms of, I guess, examples of what products and services could be in your mind. It could be about an amended or alternative recruitment process, be that digital, being more diverse. We've talked about using different language, exploring different ways that you can bring different people into your organisation. It could, for example, be support for individuals already within your organisation, so a work-based health service, supporting those within your business, maybe retaining staff more effectively. Or it could be a product that you're looking to take to wider market, that you're looking to scale up operations and sell, obviously within Cornwall and much further afield as well. So lots of breadth of opportunity to engage with us. And Ruth Gripper, who's joined us in the chat there, is our Knowledge Exchange Officer. And Ruth would be our lead contact with you to support that relationship. Okay, that was my short advert. I'm going to stop sharing that now. And Laura, is there any comments, questions that we'd want to pick up now?
It's been such fun in the chat today. Thank you so much to everyone who's feeding in. But also, if you would like to ask a question and not write it in the chat, you're welcome to raise your hand at any point, and we'll find you and come to you for a question. Yeah, so one thing that's been going on is a bit more on that idea of needing to network more, needing to share knowledge more. This was the comment that I meant to come to earlier from Nicholas Bailey. Nicholas says, I have found two sides to the bias equation whilst promoting accessible employment. Employers are inclined to be insular in their focus and work in their bubble, and do not automatically consider the impact of how they work on those outside of their organisation's space. They're willing to make the adjustments, but getting to them to explain and for them to understand the impact of their normal behaviour is difficult. And he says he would like more debate and awareness raising, more workshops, more discussion, more networking, and changing the normal into just, why wouldn't we? Does anyone like to respond to that before I come on to other questions from the chat?
Could I just take it as an opportunity to talk about a few ways that we can mitigate bias according to ACAS? And I think it picks up on quite a few of the bits and pieces that you've just said there and that have been said throughout the chat so far. So they give I think 5 or 6 different pieces of advice. The first is to be aware and be vigilant, which I think we kind of acknowledge the need for. Second is to take your time when making decisions, because often these unconscious biases, they happen instantaneously. And so by taking a step back and taking time, you can kind of start to mitigate those. One of them, which I think really picks up on what you were just saying there, is to work with a diverse group of people, as diverse as possible, and to share experiences. I think that really feeds into this kind of idea that a network going forward would be something that would be really useful to people, I think. And the other one is to develop policies and procedures that limit kind of individual characteristics and their ability to kind of influence decisions. And again, this just comes back to kind of making decisions in as groups where possible. Now, that's not going to necessarily be something that small companies are going to always be able to do kind of internally. And that may be where these kind of networks really start to kind of become useful. Thanks.
Thank you. That's awesome. Okay, I have a question here, and this is from our Knowledge Exchange Officer at the Inclusivity Project, Ruth Gripper, and she's aimed this at Dawn. But Ruth, would you like to ask it yourself, because you're our Knowledge Exchange person, and then everyone can see their lovely face that they'll be talking to when they come to ask for some business support. And was that implicit bias to call your face lovely? Oh no.
It's all right, I'll take it, Laura, I will take it. Yeah, thanks for putting me on the spot there. And thanks Tigger, Dawn and Dan for some really interesting comments. I've certainly found it really, really helpful actually. My question was to Dawn, and it was picking up something that you said earlier about once you'd started sort of being aware of this and paying it more attention, you noticed in your comms quite a lot of things that actually weren't as inclusive as you would have liked them to be. And I just wondered whether you could give a couple of examples of what that was, what you changed, and whether you saw an impact from that.
So it was probably less on the recruitment side, actually, because we have, it doesn't really stop that work. We go back to the work we do around EDI regularly and look to tweak that, and obviously act on feedback that we get out of those sessions. The one where we saw the biggest impact, there's two themes. One is I mentioned that I cover the inclusion remit, and we Tika will probably know this, but one of the teams that we have at Eden is our access team. So we have a team of largely volunteers who help support people with a wide range of capability needs. And we noticed then that the leaflet that we had that supported that at the time actually wasn't that accessible. When we took it back, I was doing a project. It probably goes back about 3 years ago. So I was doing a project that had been requested by our board at the time around inclusion and how we made Eden more accessible. And actually the starting point when we looked at our literature for that was, actually, this isn't the best it could be. So it certainly changed that. And that came in terms of wording, simplifying it, making it, I guess some people might call it vanilla, but making it very clear English, but accessible. The second part to that was around actually training people to recognise that there were different, we were all different, and even twins are different, identical twins, there'll always be a difference. So we have a group of, it's a growing group now, of inclusion champions. So people that do push and challenge and ask us to think about other things. So for example, in the we all know what we've been doing in this lockdown period. We've had Eden reopened just the outside gardens in the middle of June, and then this coming Saturday we reopen fully. So one of the things that I'm on a call later about is, and we've never actually got to do this fully at Eden, is having a protected window for people who can come in who are vulnerable or with additional needs. And we can do that now much more efficiently because we've got a time ticketing system. So we now know when our busiest times are and our quiet times are, and we can use that to actually open that space more fluidly to people that would be more comfortable in quieter environments, whether that's visiting site or the shop or working. So that's one change. The other was on marketing. So when we actually analysed, we were doing some research on our, the product and the offer and who our demographics were, and there were big chunks of demographics that, if you looked at how we were advertising, wouldn't be attracted to Eden. I've had emails where people have said, "Well, why would I want to come and visit you? I don't see anybody like me coming to visit you." And that's where people have looked at your online presence, your marketing presence, any literature that you've got, and you have to say, "I get it." So we changed then a lot of the way we did our marketing to hopefully add to that element of how we change that. So people, because we've always said Eden's for everybody, always, but actually the reality of that was it wasn't. Not when you looked at how people felt about being attracted to it. So we've seen some quite big changes, but there are, I think the main one for me is that challenge. It's creating an environment where people are comfortable to challenge and comfortable to ask questions and say if they think something's not right. And I think that's the key to developing it, whether you're a small or a large organisation, that you're willing to listen.
Brilliant. Thanks, Dawn. Anybody with any other comments? Else there's something in the chat I'd quite like to pick up. Okay, Laura, sorry, would you like to do that?
No, that's cool. I have put a question out earlier on in the chat, and if you've been in the chat later on, you probably missed it, but I just put it out, the question very simply, what is bias as you experience it? And is there anyone here who can identify an experience of being on the receiving end of bias that we can hear as an example? Because I think the more that we see examples, the more that we can actually kind of spot it when it's coming up. And Ruth Gawthorpe posted a reply to that, which I found really interesting, which was that she says, when I became disabled after a back operation went awry, I realized just how biased I'd probably been. I suddenly saw life from another perspective. I was in a wheelchair for a year. I hobble now, and I can't tell you the number of people who spoke to my husband about me rather than to me. It was sort of like my brain wasn't working. Well, it was. Mm-hmm. And I just wanted to share that as a really kind of tangible example of where bias shows up. And I also wanted to kind of shout that out to everybody who's here, the panel and beyond, to share their experiences as well, if they have these little examples.
I know exactly where that's come, that feeling comes from. Many years ago, my mum had a spinal injury, and we were, we'd managed to navigate Hong Kong on holiday, and they were brilliant in Hong Kong. We took a day trip across to China. Mum was in a wheelchair, and this was really before Chinese people. So you were still in the era of, banned to have more children, and things were hidden. And I can remember it was a very uncomfortable experience where we were in a shopping stroke cultural complex, and people were literally walking 360 degrees around us with mum in a wheelchair because they hadn't seen anyone in a wheelchair. Now, that's not in this country, that was in China. But it was such an uncomfortable experience that you just think, I never want to be in that situation again. The other one, and it links to that, is I take part on the Exeter Leadership Programme. So I do that for my development. And it was last summer, we were at one of our regular development events, and we had a lady speaking to us, a lady called Sarah Piercy. I don't know if anyone's come across Sarah. Sarah's local, she lives in the southwest, and I can't remember the nature of her disability, but she also uses a wheelchair the majority of the time, but she's also a very accomplished sportswoman, amongst many other things. And it was very interesting. I went and sat next to her at before we got started on day one, and we were chatting away. Didn't think anything, but it wasn't until she did her presentation later and she said, only one person came to speak to me. And that's a group of senior leaders from all sorts of organisations, from charity sector to private sector to military. One person, and that was me, apart from the people hosting it. So the leaders of the programme went and sat next to her. She was in her wheelchair, went and sat and spoke to her. Now, that tells me an awful lot about, people that you would expect to be leading this debate in their organisations actually alienated a key speaker. So it was a very interesting 2 days after that because Sarah stayed with us over those 2 days and was part of our part of the activities that we did. So those kind of, for me, that's when the shock factor is often when people really learn, because they all would have said they weren't biased at all, when I'm sure if you had asked them in that room.
Thank you, Dawn. I'm a little conscious of time, so I'd like to come to Edward for his comment. Then I'm just going to pick up on some interesting comments in the chat about individuals disclosing potential health conditions or disabilities, and maybe tease out, what organisations can do to be as open and approachable as possible, so people do feel confident in doing that. And then we'll need to start to think about wrapping up. We'll get some final takeaways from our panel members, and just a little bit of closure. But I think we're on target to finish for 11:30. But Edward, if you'd like to make your comment, please.
Again, it's an observation about wheelchair users. I met an amazing lady from Newcastle, Mary Laver. She had rheumatoid arthritis when she was very young, and she's lost all her mobility. The only thing she can move is her right arm very slightly. And so she's in a wheelchair most of the time. And she talks about does Mary take sugar in her tea problem? Because people will always talk to a carer rather than her. And I think part of it is because you're at the same level as the person that's standing up. You're not at the same level as the person in the wheelchair. And then the other thing that really, well, a couple of things that surprised me about Mary, she always talks about when she's in bed, she's free. And I always thought, well, when she was in a wheelchair, she was free because she could move about, because she had a powered wheelchair. But what she meant was she had everything about her when she was in her bed, and she felt free then. And it just, that looking at things from that different perspective. And then at the time I was into extreme sports, and Mary wanted to do something extreme. And in the end, she drove her powered wheelchair from Land's End to John O'Groats. Just because she could just use that thing to do, people lifted her into it, lifted her out at the end of the day. And her vicar, and she was a very religious lady, her vicar didn't want her to do it because disabled people didn't do that sort of thing. And I just found that such a, and I think we do that, we put people in boxes and say they can't do things when they can do things. So I just wanted to share that with you.
And I think there's, you know, we've talked here about several examples about people being in wheelchairs, and of course that's a very visible disability, but actually that's a very small percentage of people who are disabled. So the hidden disabilities, and I'm sure Tigger would, you know, understands this fully with what he supports, is actually the hidden disabilities that are more important in many ways to understand, to be able to overcome the bias. Because I think there is an assumption that if people look fine, what's the problem? And it's such a terrible broad brush statement. I personally, I'm registered disabled. I have mobility and breathing issues. I use a blue badge. I've been challenged on having a blue badge before because I get out of the car and have some mobility, but it's not a great level of mobility. So it's that changing those kind of perceptions is it's generational. That's not something, and it's still going to continue. It's quite interesting that, you know, you have to have those tough conversations, and you feel like you have to validate yourself. And and if bias was at a better place, you shouldn't need to do that.
I mean, awesome stuff. From the National Autistic Society give a figure of 1 in 100 for individuals that may be awesomely upon that spectrum. A lot of stuff across the globe puts it a lot lower than that, maybe 1 in 50. That's huge. That is absolutely huge. And in the early days, autism was considered, forgive the terms, a hidden disability, because you didn't have, you know, strange ears or a wheelchair or, you know, whatever visual aspect came along with somebody's disability, as was termed in those days. And you're right, and that level of bias is incredible. So 1 in 50 is a huge amount of population that just accepts, sees and experiences these differently to that, so I'll use that term again, predominant neurotype. And I think, again, there's an issue there again about, again, going back to people will not accept that they have to do reasonable adjustments maybe, unless you have a piece of paper. And who gives you the piece of paper? It's a clinician, etc. And then you are diagnosed, there's something wrong with you. And to me, the bias goes on and on and on. So it's fascinating.
And it's interesting, isn't it, that you say that about a piece of paper and that it's almost like you have to prove it. Well, would we ask you to prove you're well?
Exactly.
Would we? No, of course we wouldn't. So if you have, and on some of the other work I've been doing on Beacon with Claire, you know, some of this around not just stereotypes, but challenging and reasonable adjustments. Actually, reasonable adjustments, I've just read somebody's comment there about being at university. Reasonable adjustments can actually be very small things. Often there's no cost attached to them. Very, you know, a conversation with somebody that talks about what their needs are and what those adjustments might look like can actually be something very small or very low cost. You know, we're not talking about installing things at tens of thousands of pounds, and just those very small differences can make a difference. I think I've seen Carol Theobald on the line from Eyesight Cornwall. And I can remember a conversation when I was doing the inclusion project with her and Terry about, and I said, "Oh, do you know, it's terrible. We haven't, we've only got one Braille guidebook." And they said, "Well, what do you want one of those for?" because there are other more, but that was my, that was my understanding of it. And actually there are different and better methods for people who are visually impaired now than there were historically. So we've implemented some of those, but they're not massive cost items. And I think that's where, from an employment point of view, that's one of the myth busters, that having somebody who has additional needs is going to cost you a fortune. Well, actually, what about what you get in return from that, actually, by having somebody that is a capable employee with those adjustments?
Yeah. And I'll argue, discuss, discourse as well, that more often or not, there's a bias towards that term, reasonable adjustment. Somebody goes, and the employer might go, well, I can't afford it. But also, a lot of reasonable adjustments are free. It's how you communicate, it's how you act, it's lighting, it's turning a light off, it's turning a fan off, moving a clock out of a room from a sensory issue, whatever. But sometimes these reasonable adjustments help everybody. They just didn't realize it. They help everybody in the environment, and they just didn't realize that a subtle change of lighting or communication practices or noise levels, everybody else goes, they've done the quiet hours in shops. I helped Sainsbury's in Truro do their quiet hour a couple of years ago, and I did a survey after Christmas, and almost everybody I spoke to said it's so much nicer to shop. The lights aren't so bright, there isn't music playing, I've had a really long stressful day, and it's so nice just to come into this really welcoming environment. Though it was done initially for the world of autism, almost everybody I met went, oh, it's so much nicer, and that was a reasonable adjustment. Yet everybody felt so much better because of it.
Totally agree with that, Tigger.
Yeah, that's a really great point, Tigger. Can I just move the conversation on, because I want to make sure that we have time to discuss this point about disclosure and whether people are willing to disclose issues. And I think there's two points to it. There's whether people are willing to disclose at the point of application, and then there's whether they're willing to disclose if they develop a condition whilst in work. And I think at the recruitment stage, for example, if people are signed up to Disability Confident, the people should at least be willing to disclose, because if they disclose and they meet the job requirements, they'll be guaranteed an interview. But it's how you then encourage that kind of ongoing disclosure if people develop conditions or if people's conditions deteriorate in work. And so I'll just pass back over to you two to.
We've done a lot of work in this area, and again with Claire through the Beacon project, that we've actually seen over the last 3 years the approach we've taken to in-work changes of health have really helped our overall sickness levels, which perhaps sounds a bit weird. Actually, by particularly around mental health, having early intervention and working as sometimes it's not just a partnership, it's often a three-way agreement, can help people to stay in the workplace longer. It can help get people back to work sooner. So we absolutely act on those when people come to us. We don't seem to have a problem with them declaring things to us. I think, but I like to, well, hope, and I think that's because we approach it pragmatically and we do try and find solutions. In the 10 years I've been at Eden, I think over that 10 years, I was thinking about it yesterday, I think there's only 2 people that we've had to, we've not been able to either redeploy or meet adjustment requirements in that time, where we've had some quite serious illnesses and things that happen ongoing. Much more difficult, I would accept, in a smaller organisation than it is for us, perhaps, because we've got flexibility to help move people around. But the way I kind of approach it is that person still has a value to the organisation, an absolute value. They've generally got good knowledge of the organisation, and they will have skills that have kept them there. So it's for me, it's looking at what we would need to do for them, and as Tigger's already said, most of this is very low cost. To be able to keep somebody like that is not just about the well-being for that individual, but also I think the wider team see a different support culture.
Thank you, Dawn. I mean, it comes back to, for me, a point that was made quite early on in the conversation, really, about having the policies or implementing policies is one thing, but changing the culture of an organisation is much more challenging and difficult to do. And also, individuals' awareness, understanding, and then actions, again, a challenge, and then trying to do that on a societal level, another step. So really interesting conversation that this hopefully will continue as part of the Inclusivity project and in your own networks as well. And we're really keen to take that forward. I am conscious of time, so what I'm keen to do is to hand over very shortly to individual panel members, just with your takeaway point, and then I'll do a final thank you and farewell. I appreciate if people do need to leave at 11:30, then thank you very much for participating, but please drift away if you need to, and thank you all for your participation. So,
and
Tigger,
just to say, because there were a few comments in the chat that I hadn't been able to get to, but just a thank you for all that you've been sharing there. Some people have been sharing examples of hidden disabilities, struggling to get them acknowledged by their different employers, things like ME, anxiety and depression, the fact of having had cancer operations or heart operations, dyslexia and dyspraxia, all of these things that we would never know about people, and that can be so easily dismissed by this idea of people looking fine. And so thank you all for sharing your personal experiences. It's really helpful for us as an organisation too.
Thank you. So if we go to Tigger, Daniel, and Dawn for final comments.
Okay. Thank you all for listening today. And to me, in the world that I live in, it's desperately important to make people realise that from my perspective, 1 in 50, the world of autism is huge. And if you need and want to know more about that world of autism, listen to autism culture, listen to autism voices. Neurodiversity is a buzzword that came along several years ago, and it's huge. We are all gorgeously neurodiverse in so many ways. And I think it's important that we accept people for who they are. Disclosure is difficult, I think, for so many individuals, especially in the workplace, because they're going to, I'm going to lose my job. There can be bias towards people, going to think I'm different. Inclusivity is so important. I do feel very strongly at this moment in time, because of the pandemic, because we're doing things differently. We're at a crossroads now, and we have a chance to change our attitudes, to change our perceptions, to change our beliefs, and to be so much more inclusive than we've been before. So from an autism viewpoint, listen to people who are awesomely autistic. You will learn so much. And a lot of those reasonable adjustments, as I said earlier on, I think you'll be incredibly surprised they cost nothing. And B, the whole workforce might go, hey, this is really cool. And that's what you're after, really, is making everybody feel included and important and listened to. So thank you for listening today.
Thank you, Tigger. Great words. Daniel?
I'll keep mine quite short. I think I would just say to be aware of this and to talk about it. I think that's kind of the first step and a really good starting place.
Thank you. And Dawn, your final takeaway?
I definitely echo what Tigger said in terms of, this often costs nothing, and listen to people around you. The Inclusivity project that we ran a few years ago was user-based, and that gave us some great feedback. From an employment point of view, I think you have to be prepared to challenge, check, and implement a change. And then it's not just a one and done, it continues to be a cycle. Don't think you've done it and it's on the shelf. Be prepared to keep challenging it to keep it at the level it needs to be.
Brilliant. Just back to a couple of slides from me. So thank you once again for everyone's participation. Just like to raise awareness of our next event, which is a coffee morning with Ben Bolton, which is a follow-up from our accessible working webinar, which took place a couple of weeks ago. So that's penciled in for the 30th of June.
That's today.
It is.
It's happened.
On the other channel, 9th of July from memory, the 9th of July, that'll be taking place. But we'll be circulating that through our email contact. We'll be promoting via social media, as we have done with other activities. So welcome your input and attendance into that. We'll have other events planned before probably taking a slight break over the summer months, but really keen to keep you engaged, contributing to this exciting research and business support project, and really thank you for your participation. And just to finish, another thank you. There's our contact details, website, social media, and just do make contact. You know, we really want to hear from you, your ideas, and where you think you can support us in delivering this project. I think that's probably it. Thank you very much, and hopefully see you soon.
Bye.
Thank you so much. Cheers.
Thanks. Bye.